In the shadows of occupied Europe, the war was not fought with tanks or artillery alone. It was fought with whispers, with coded letters slipped beneath doors, with messages tapped in Morse code across darkened rooms. And in this hidden world of deception and courage, women, ordinary women, became the unlikely soldiers of a silent war. When the German war machine swept across Europe, resistance seemed impossible. France had fallen. The Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, all under Hitler's boot. The air itself seemed filled with fear. Yet amid that darkness, women like Odette Sansom, Violette Sabo, Noor Inayat Khan, and Nancy Wake refused to surrender. They were teachers, mothers, secretaries, daughters, but the war transformed them into spies, saboteurs, and couriers who risked everything for freedom. London's Special Operations Executive, or SOE, called them agents, but to the Gestapo, they were ghosts. Women who moved unseen, carrying radios in suitcases, explosives in handbags, and hope in their hearts. They operated under false names, forged identities, and the constant threat of capture and torture. Yet they went willingly, knowing that one wrong step could mean a bullet in the back of the head. For them, war wasn't fought on the battlefield. It was fought in train stations, farmhouses, and hotel rooms. It was fought through whispers, glances, and invisible courage. And as the Allies planned their return to the continent, these women became their eyes and ears, sending coded transmissions from behind enemy lines, preparing the way for liberation. The story of the women of the resistance is one of silent strength, where bravery didn't wear medals, but carried secrets that could change the course of history. The call to join the resistance didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, in a letter, a meeting in a smoky cafe, a whispered invitation in a crowded train compartment. Many of these women didn't see themselves as heroes. They were drawn in by necessity, by loss, by anger. Some had seen their families deported. Others had watched their towns burn, and others, like Noor Inayat Khan, were motivated by something deeper, a moral duty to fight tyranny, even at the cost of their lives. Noor was an unlikely spy. The daughter of an Indian mystic and an American mother, she was gentle, artistic, and deeply spiritual. Yet when France fell, she joined the RAF Women's Auxiliary Air Force and later the SOE. Fluent in French, she was trained as a wireless operator, one of the most dangerous roles in occupied territory. The life expectancy of such agents was barely 6 weeks, but Noor volunteered without hesitation. Meanwhile, across the channel, Odette Sansom, a French woman living in England, volunteered for the SOE despite having 3 children. She had never fired a gun, but her determination was unshakable. During training, instructors noted her calm resilience. "Courage," she said once, "is doing what you must even when you're afraid." These women were not recruited because they were killers. They were chosen because they could blend in, because the enemy would not suspect them. They were underestimated, and that underestimation became their greatest weapon. They could move through checkpoints, charm German officers, and pass intelligence unnoticed. But once the training began, sabotage, codes, parachute jumps, survival, they became soldiers of the invisible war. And as the instructors watched these women leap into darkness over occupied France, even the hard-bitten veterans of Britain's intelligence services were left in awe. It was midnight over France. The moon hung low, pale and silent, as the plane's engines droned above the countryside. Inside, 3 agents sat strapped in, hearts pounding, fingers clenched around their parachute cords. Among them was Violette Sabo, a young mother barely in her 20s. Her husband, a French soldier, had been killed in North Africa. She had vowed to fight in his memory. The light in the cabin turned green. One by one, they stepped into the abyss. The wind roared in Violette's ears as she fell, a streak of shadow against the night. Below her, the farmlands of France stretched like a quilt of darkness. She hit the ground, rolled, and quickly buried her parachute. Within minutes, she had vanished into the countryside, just another face in a nation under occupation. Every landing was a gamble. The Gestapo had infiltrated networks. Many resistance cells were already compromised. One mistake, one careless word could unravel everything. Yet the SOE's women kept coming, wave after wave of courage descending from the skies. Violette's mission was to organize sabotage operations and assist in coordinating the French resistance before the D-Day landings. Her charm and fearlessness made her invaluable. She rode bicycles through occupied zones, carrying secret messages tucked into her clothes. German patrols questioned her more than once, but she smiled, spoke perfect French, and passed unnoticed. Every night, she sent coded radio transmissions back to London, using phrases only her handlers could decode. Each click of the key risked her life. German detection trucks could trace signals in minutes, but she stayed on air long enough to send critical updates about troop movements and supply lines. In those nights, surrounded by danger and betrayal, the war wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with faith in themselves, in their cause, and in the hope that their small acts of defiance could help turn the tide of the greatest conflict in human history. Across occupied France, a hidden web of resistance grew in silence. It connected farmers, priests, teachers, railway workers, and women who risked everything to carry messages, hide fugitives, or sabotage German supply lines. This web was fragile, invisible, and constantly hunted, but within it, women became the lifeblood that kept the networks alive. Each city had its own rhythm of fear. In Paris, couriers cycled through the narrow streets with notes stitched into their coats. In Lyon, women met in bakeries to pass coded phrases disguised as shopping lists. In Normandy, secret transmitters hummed quietly in attics as agents sent desperate bursts of Morse code to London. The women of the resistance didn't just pass messages now, they were the messages. They carried intelligence, food, and courage across a landscape suffocated by fear. Nancy Wake, known to the Germans as the White Mouse for her uncanny ability to evade capture, became one of the most wanted figures in France. Smart, bold, and impossibly brave, Nancy worked with the French Maquis, coordinating sabotage and smuggling Allied airmen out of the country. The Gestapo placed a 5 million franc bounty on her head, yet she continued, disguising herself, changing names, moving like smoke through occupied territory. To survive in this hidden world required more than bravery. It demanded calculation. One mistake meant not just death but torture, betrayal, and the destruction of entire networks. Every knock on the door made hearts stop. Every phone ring could be a trap. Yet they persisted not out of recklessness, but out of faith. Faith that their small acts, multiplied across hundreds of villages, could slowly strangle the Nazi war machine. By 1943, these networks had become the nerve system of Allied intelligence in Europe. Every coded transmission, every derailed train, every bridge destroyed by saboteurs traced back in some way to the women who fought from the shadows. By 1943, the Gestapo's patience had run thin. German intelligence had grown ruthless, desperate to crush the growing underground movements. They began rounding up suspected agents by the dozens. Interrogations turned to torture, and torture turned to executions. The walls of occupied Europe began closing in on the women who had dared to defy Hitler's empire. Odette Sansom, operating under the codename Lisa, was eventually betrayed and captured in France. She was taken to Fresnes prison, where the Gestapo interrogated her mercilessly. They broke her bones, branded her flesh, and demanded names of fellow agents. But Odette remained silent. Even under unimaginable pain, she told them nothing. When her captors mocked her loyalty, she whispered through swollen lips, "I have nothing to say to you." Elsewhere, Noor Inayat Khan, after months of transmitting secret messages in Paris, was betrayed by a double agent. The Gestapo stormed her safe house, capturing her radio and codes. She was imprisoned in solitary confinement for nearly a year, chained, beaten, yet never revealing her network. Even when the Germans tricked her with forged letters, she refused to compromise her fellow agents. In the end, Noor was executed in Dachau, her final word reportedly a single defiant cry, "Liberté." For each of these women, the war had become deeply personal. Their courage wasn't born of glory or fame, but conviction. They knew the stakes. Every message they sent, every mission they took could decide the lives of thousands. Their silence, their endurance became as vital as any Allied victory in battle. In London, handlers listening for signals that would never come knew what it meant when the line went silent. Yet their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The courage of the women of the resistance became a quiet legend, proof that even in the darkest prisons, the human spirit could remain unbroken. As 1944 dawned, the winds of war began to shift. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Normandy, D-Day, the greatest amphibious operation in history. But its success depended not only on the armies poised along Britain's coast, but also on the invisible network of agents scattered across occupied Europe. The women of the resistance became the pulse of that network. They sabotaged railways to delay German reinforcements. They relayed coded weather reports to guide Allied bombers. They mapped German troop positions, disguising their notes in children's drawings or recipes. Their work was dangerous, but now it carried new urgency. The liberation of Europe was near, and every message mattered. Violette Sabo was among those who returned to France to prepare for D-Day operations. Her mission was to link up with the Maquis, coordinate attacks on German supply lines, and prepare ambushes. But her convoy was intercepted by a German patrol near Limoges. She fought fiercely, covering her comrades' escape until she ran out of ammunition. Captured and taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp, she endured brutal treatment. Yet even in captivity, her spirit never broke. When fellow prisoners asked her why she fought, she answered simply, "Because my country needed me." In those critical weeks before D-Day, hundreds of women, many unknown and unrecorded, risked their lives to paralyze German communications. Telephone lines were cut, ammunition trains derailed, bridges destroyed. By the time Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, the German response was in chaos, thanks in no small part to the invisible army of women who had fought in silence. The tide of war was turning. And though many of these women would never live to see victory, their courage had already reshaped history. The Nazis had tried to silence them, but in doing so, they made their defiance eternal. The summer of 1944 brought a sound that had long been only a dream, the distant rumble of Allied artillery. From Normandy to Paris, from Lyon to Bordeaux, word spread like wildfire. They're coming. For the women of the resistance, it was both a moment of triumph and heartbreak. Liberation meant survival for some, but for many others it came too late. As Allied tanks rolled through the streets of French villages, people wept openly, waving flags they had hidden for years. Women who had risked everything stepped out of the shadows, couriers, spies, radio operators, each with a story etched into her face. Some reunited with comrades who thought them dead. Others walked silently among the cheering crowds, knowing their friends would never return. The resistance networks, once secret and scattered, now emerged as heroes of the liberation. Yet their work was not done. In the final months of the war, women continued to serve as medics, translators, and guides, aiding Allied troops pushing eastward. Many who had lived as fugitives now stood openly beside generals. Their courage, once whispered about, now became legend, though often told in fragments and half-truths. Nancy Wake returned to Paris in August 1944, her heart torn between pride and sorrow. She had survived the impossible, but she had lost her husband, Henri Fiocca, executed by the Gestapo for refusing to betray her. In the crowded cafes of liberated Paris, she drank to his memory, and to the thousands who had died nameless so that others could live free. As the swastikas were torn down and replaced by the tricolor, Europe began to breathe again. Yet in the quiet that followed, the women of the resistance faced a new kind of silence, the silence of being forgotten. After the war, Europe tried to rebuild. Cities rose from rubble. Soldiers came home and nations rewrote their histories. But in that reconstruction, something precious was lost. The stories of the women who had fought from the shadows. Men returned as decorated heroes, their medals shining in parades and ceremonies. The women who had risked just as much, often more, were told to return to normal life. Governments quietly closed intelligence files, names were redacted, missions erased. In France, Britain, and across Europe, the courage of female agents faded into dusty archives. Odette Sansom was awarded the George Cross for her bravery, one of the few women to receive such an honor. Yet she lived the rest of her life haunted by the memory of those who didn't return. Noor Inayat Khan was posthumously awarded the George Cross as well, but for years her story was barely mentioned in history books. Even Nancy Wake, who became one of the most decorated women of the war, struggled to find peace in a world that preferred silence over remembrance. The truth was uncomfortable. These women had defied every expectation society placed upon them. They had led men into battle, outwitted Nazi intelligence, and proven that courage was not defined by gender. Yet when peace came, their defiance, once a weapon against tyranny, became inconvenient. Still, their legacy endured quietly. In the families they saved, in the networks that survived, and in the hearts of those who remembered their names. And decades later, historians would reopen the archives, uncovering the invisible heroes who had helped win the war from the shadows. Decades after the guns fell silent, new generations began to rediscover the stories of these women. Fragments of courage buried in classified documents, old photographs, and fading diaries. What emerged was not just history, but revelation. Filmmakers, journalists, and historians began piecing together their lives, the secret missions, the coded messages, the small acts of rebellion that changed the course of the war. Statues were raised, streets were renamed, monuments dedicated, and slowly, the world began to understand that victory in World War II was not just won on the battlefields, but in the shadows, by women who fought with nothing but their wits, their courage, and their will. In 2012, a bronze bust of Noor Inayat Khan was unveiled in London, the first memorial in Britain dedicated to an Asian woman and a spy. Visitors still come, leaving flowers and small notes at her feet. Thank you for your bravery. Nancy Wake's story inspired books and films. Odette Sansom's defiance became a symbol of unbreakable spirit. And countless unnamed women, those who smuggled food, forged documents, carried messages, were finally given a place in history. Their stories remind us that true courage often comes quietly. It doesn't seek glory or recognition. It acts because it must. These women didn't fight for medals or praise. They fought because freedom was worth everything. And so, as history looks back on the great battles of the Second World War, the women of the resistance stand eternal, invisible no more, their bravery echoing through time like a whisper that refuses to fade. When the war ended in 1945, the streets of Europe filled with music, laughter, and relief. Yet for many of the women of the resistance, the sound of victory rang hollow. They had survived the unimaginable: betrayal, torture, hunger, loss. But peace brought a new kind of struggle, remembering how to live again. For years, these women had moved in the shadows, their lives governed by fear and adrenaline. Now the silence of peacetime felt unbearable. Some returned to families who barely recognized them. Others discovered that everyone they loved was gone. The war had stripped them of everything except the will to endure. Odette Sansom, who had survived Ravensbrück concentration camp, was one of them. Her body was frail, her spirit unbroken. She had faced the Gestapo's brutality and never once betrayed a secret. Yet when she returned to England, she found herself haunted by memories she couldn't share. Nightmares came like clockwork. The screams, the cold, the smell of burning. She once said softly, "You can survive anything, but you never escape it." For Nancy Wake, life after the resistance was equally conflicted. She was hailed as a hero, decorated by Britain, France, and America. But behind her wit and humor was grief too deep to express. Her husband Henri had died because of her work, and though she laughed and drank with the same fierce energy she fought with, she carried that loss like a shadow she could never outpace. Freedom had been won, but the women who helped win it bore scars that no medal could heal. As years passed, the world moved on. The great powers rebuilt their cities, wrote their histories, and returned to the rhythm of peace. But for the women of the resistance, peace was complex, both gift and ghost. Many never spoke of what they had done. They married, raised families, worked in offices and shops, and never told their children that once they had smuggled weapons or fought behind enemy lines. When asked about the war, they would smile faintly and change the subject. Silence became their second skin. It wasn't shame that kept them quiet, and it was pain. The weight of memory was too heavy to carry into everyday life. To speak of it meant to relive it. Some, like Violette Szabo's daughter, only learned the truth from declassified documents decades later, discovering that their mothers had died as heroes, not victims. Yet in their silence there was also quiet pride. They had not fought for glory or recognition. They had fought for decency, for freedom, for the idea that evil must never go unchallenged. Their bravery had not come from training or rank, but from conviction. The belief that even in darkness one can still choose light. History books for years overlooked them, focusing on generals and politicians. But time, as it always does, began to uncover what had been forgotten. Historians found letters, diaries, photographs, small fragments of immense courage. The truth began to surface, shimmering like sunlight breaking through old dust. By the turn of the 21st century, the world began to remember. Exhibitions were held, documentaries made, and books written about the women who had fought unseen. Their faces, once blurred in photographs marked classified, now appeared in museums and memorials, finally granted the honor they deserved. In France, memorial plaques were unveiled for agents of the Réseau du Souvenir. In Britain, the names of the Special Operations executive women were etched in stone at the Tempsford Memorial. Visitors read the names: Odette Sansom, Violette Sabo, Noor Inayat Khan, Nancy Wake, and dozens more, some known only by code names. Their stories became a bridge between generations. School children learned that war is not only fought by armies but by individuals, often ordinary people, who decide to stand against tyranny. Artists painted their portraits. Writers captured their courage in verse, and the world finally began to see these women not as supporting figures, but as central to the story of resistance. Even now, their courage resonates, a reminder that freedom is fragile and that heroism often wears no uniform. In the quiet courage of their actions, in the whispered defiance of their missions, they left behind a truth that still burns bright, that the fight for what is right begins in the heart of the individual. And as long as that truth is remembered, the women of the resistance will never fade from history's light. The legacy of the women of the resistance did not end when the guns fell silent. Their courage quietly influenced the post-war world in ways few could have predicted. As nations rebuilt, new intelligence agencies were born: MI6, the CIA, the DGSE, and behind their foundations lay lessons learned from the wartime networks that had thrived in chaos. Many of these agencies studied the structure of the resistance, its decentralized cells, its coded communications, its ability to survive even under total surveillance. And within those lessons were the fingerprints of women, the methods pioneered by female agents, invisible, meticulous, psychological, became the blueprint for modern espionage. Some, like Odette Sansom, served briefly in post-war intelligence. Others, such as Vera Atkins, dedicated their lives to finding and honoring the women who never returned. Atkins traveled across Europe, visiting camps and grave sites, piecing together the fates of her fallen agents. Her work ensured that those who had vanished in silence were finally given names, stories, and graves marked with dignity. But perhaps their greatest legacy was not strategic. It was moral. They proved that strength is not measured by rank but by resolve, that courage can come from those society underestimates, and that when faced with oppression, even the quietest soul can change the course of history. Their bravery inspired generations of women to enter fields once closed to them, from military command to intelligence work, from diplomacy to politics. The shadows they once fought in had finally given way to light. In the decades after the war, a new kind of resistance began to take shape, not against invading armies, but against the erasure of truth. Historians, journalists, and families of the fallen worked tirelessly to recover lost stories. Boxes of faded photographs emerged from attics. Letters written in cramped handwriting were translated and archived. Slowly, the mosaic of women's wartime heroism began to take form. In France, the story of Violette Sabo became a national symbol of youthful defiance. In Britain, films and biographies celebrated the invisible heroines of the Special Operations Executive. Noor Inayat Khan, the Indian-born wireless operator who refused to betray her comrades under Gestapo torture, became a symbol of unity. Her statue now stands in Gordon Square, London. But remembrance wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about learning from it. The women of the resistance had operated with empathy as much as bravery. They fought not for conquest, but for liberation. Their resilience in the face of terror became a moral compass for a new generation, confronting the dangers of authoritarianism and hate. In classrooms across Europe, their names were spoken once again, not as whispers of espionage, but as lessons in humanity. Their stories began to bridge divides, reminding young people that heroism has no gender, and that freedom must be guarded not just by soldiers, but by ordinary people who dare to say no to tyranny. Their legacy became a living force, a call to conscience that still echoes through history's halls. Time, as always, has softened the edges of history. The war that once defined a generation now lives in books, films, and memorials. But the spirit of the women who fought from the shadows remains undimmed, carried forward in every story of quiet defiance, every act of moral courage in the face of darkness. Imagine them now in the silence before a coded transmission, in the heartbeat before a mission, in the moment of decision where fear meets duty. Each of them made a choice to act when others turned away, to risk everything for people they would never meet, to believe that freedom, even when fragile, was worth dying for. Their courage was not loud. It did not roar across battlefields or thunder through speeches. It whispered in cellars and forests, in narrow alleys beneath occupied cities. It lived in coded words, smuggled notes, and the soft defiance of women who refused to kneel. Today, as the world faces new forms of tyranny, their example remains more relevant than ever. They remind us that the strength of a civilization lies not in its armies, but in its conscience, and that true victory is not the absence of war, but the triumph of humanity over fear. The women of the resistance did not seek glory, yet they became legends. They lived and died in the shadows, and from those shadows they taught the world how to stand in the light.